The sun had barely risen over the edges of Manila's skyline, but already the air carried the weight of another humid day. The streets buzzed with life, jeepneys groaned past in fits of mechanical exhaustion, children chased each other barefoot between street vendors shouting prices over piles of fruit, and everywhere the sounds of a city refusing to sleep echoed through tight alleys and wide, crumbling boulevards. Among the clutter of color and noise, a small girl moved like a shadow that no one noticed. Her skin was dark, a deep mahogany that stood out even among the many shades of the street. Her hair, matted into thick clumps, hung heavy over her ears. The oversized t-shirt she wore was torn at the hem and stained with days of living without soap or shelter. The flip-flops on her feet didn't match, one blue, one green, and both were broken at the heel. She was perhaps 9 years old, maybe younger. But there was a look in her eyes that did not belong to children. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was that quiet, distant expression worn by those who had already stopped expecting anything from the world. She walked with purpose, not wandering like the other street kids she passed. Her destination was specific, the church at the corner of Pedro Gil Street, a towering, aging building where old women still crossed themselves at every entrance, and priests shouted their homilies over malfunctioning speakers. It was Sunday. There would be food. The church doors stood open, wide and inviting, the way sanctuaries always are. Inside, the congregation had already begun singing, off-key but earnest. The girl lingered at the steps, glancing up at the massive crucifix above the doors. It was chipped, the face of Christ weather-worn and softened by time. She did not cross herself. She stepped inside without ceremony. The air was different in the church, cooler, quiet, heavy with incense and expectation. The pews were full, men in pressed shirts and women in floral dresses clutched rosaries, murmuring prayers. The priest was deep in his sermon, but his voice sounded distant to her, like a radio playing in another room. She moved along the wall, unnoticed for the first few minutes, her eyes darting, not toward the altar, not toward the statue of the Virgin, but to the corner near the sacristy. That's where the food would be laid out after Mass. Bread mostly. Sweet bread, sometimes rice, occasionally small packets of juice. Not much, but enough. She could smell it already. Or maybe she imagined it. An older woman sitting near the aisle caught sight of her. Their eyes met briefly. The woman frowned, then looked away quickly, clutching her purse a little tighter. Another man followed her with a suspicious glance. She didn't belong here, and not just because she was a child alone. Her skin, her clothes, her hunger. They spoke too loudly. She kept her head down and inched toward the corner as the Mass concluded. People stood, lined up to receive communion. The girl waited behind a pillar, invisible, watching the volunteers begin to set out trays on the folding tables. Simple things: loaves, crackers, slices of banana, a pitcher of water. As the crowd began to disperse, she moved. She didn't rush. She had learned that rushing made people nervous. She approached the table slowly, like she was supposed to be there, like maybe someone in the crowd had brought her and she had just wandered off. Her hand trembled as she reached for a small piece of bread. The volunteer, a teenage boy in a red polo shirt with a cross stitched over the breast pocket, looked up just in time. His hand moved faster than hers. He blocked her. "Sorry," he said in Tagalog, frowning. "That's not for you." She didn't understand every word, but she knew what he meant. Her hand dropped. "I'm hungry," she said in English. Her voice was soft, polite. The kind of voice that doesn't come from entitlement, but from someone who has practiced asking for things and being told no. The boy hesitated. His eyes flickered around as if looking for an adult to solve the moment. No one came. A middle-aged woman beside him gave a sharp shake of her head, then leaned over and whispered, "She's not one of ours." The girl didn't argue. She had heard it before in different words, not one of ours, not from here, not from anywhere. She stepped back from the table, but didn't leave. She stood to the side, watching each person take food, exchange polite nods and leave with full hands and full stomachs. No one looked at her. She had become a piece of the wall. Her stomach growled audibly, a cruel primal noise that made a baby nearby start crying. Still, no one looked. She pressed a hand to her belly and sat down on the cold marble floor beside a statue of St. Francis. The stone felt like ice through the thin fabric of her shorts. She leaned her head back against the wall, closed her eyes. For a moment, the hunger seemed to fade, replaced by something heavier, a numbness, a kind of surrender. She was tired of walking, of asking, of being stared at and ignored at the same time, of existing just outside the circle of whatever kindness this world seemed to offer others. Outside, a few raindrops began to fall, soft at first, then steadier. It tapped against the stained glass windows like a soft percussion. The sound echoed through the high ceilings of the church. Inside, the priest was gone. The volunteers were packing up. The girl was still there, still hungry, still invisible. And then, something shifted. Not in the air, not in the music, but in the people. The heavy wooden doors creaked open again, and for some reason this time everyone turned to look. A man had entered the church. He walked quickly without ceremony, dressed in simple jeans and a t-shirt. He wore a baseball cap low over his face, and water dripped from the edge of it. In his hands, a plate, a full plate, hot food, steam still rising. People stared. The room had grown strangely still. The man walked straight past the pews, past the altar, past the whispers, toward her, and the girl, for the first time that morning, lifted her eyes. They locked, and for a long moment, the whole church seemed to forget how to breathe. The man walked toward her as if he already knew her name. In his hands, the plate trembled slightly, not from the weight but from the shaking in his arms. He didn't look left or right, didn't respond to the whispers that had begun to ripple through the pews. He was focused entirely on the small figure sitting beside the statue of St. Francis, legs folded, chin resting on knees, eyes too tired for surprise. She blinked slowly, trying to make sense of what she saw. Not the plate, though that alone was surreal. Steaming rice and golden pieces of fried chicken, vegetables sautéed and glistening. But the man. There was something about him that made her hesitate, not from fear, but familiarity. The closer he got, the more her eyes widened. The hat came off. His face, still damp from the rain, was unmistakable. Manny Pacquiao. In this country, his name was carved into the soul of every city and village. He wasn't just a boxer, wasn't just a senator or a hero. He was a symbol of what could be endured, what could be survived. He had once been a hungry boy too, sleeping on benches, selling cigarettes, praying not for victories, but for meals. And now, here he was, in front of her. He knelt slowly, ignoring the ache in his knees, placing the plate down beside her like an offering. The girl stared at it, then back at him. "Anak," he said softly, in the kind of voice someone uses when they speak to their own child. "Did you eat today?" She didn't answer, not because she didn't understand, but because she wasn't sure how to answer a question like that. She shook her head slightly, her eyes flicking toward the food, then back up at him. Pacquiao sat down beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers. There was no audience now, at least not in his eyes. The people in the pews, the volunteers frozen behind tables, the priest half concealed behind a column, none of them mattered. Only the child did. He picked up a spoon and gently scooped a bit of rice and chicken, offering it to her. She hesitated, then opened her mouth. The moment her lips closed around that first bite, something in her face changed. It was as if her body remembered it was alive. She chewed slowly, her jaw shaking, her eyes welling up without sound. Another bite, then another. Pacquiao fed her with the care of someone tending to a wound. There was no hurry, no pity, just presence. A woman in the crowd began to cry. She tried to cover it with her hand, but the sound slipped through. Others followed. Some didn't understand what was happening, only that it meant something, that it was sacred in a way their liturgy rarely was. The priest stepped forward, but stopped short. Whatever sermon he'd planned to give had been reduced to silence. Pacquiao looked at the girl, his own eyes now red. He placed a hand on her back and let it rest there, steadying her. He whispered something in Tagalog that she couldn't quite understand, but the tone was unmistakable. "I see you. You matter. You're not alone." The rain outside grew heavier. The tapping on the stained glass turned into a rhythmic drumming, like applause from the sky. Cameras were out now. Cell phones mostly. People fumbling to capture what they weren't sure they were allowed to witness. But Pacquiao didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He reached into his pocket and took out a napkin, gently wiping the girl's chin. Then he did something unexpected. He bowed his head, not in a showy way. Not the exaggerated gesture of a politician. It was private, reverent. He whispered a prayer under his breath, just a few words, maybe a thank you, maybe a plea. The girl had finished eating. Her posture was straighter now, her eyes brighter, though still uncertain. She looked up at the man beside her and spoke with that same soft voice. Did you come?" He smiled, not a public smile, a tired, knowing smile that seemed carved from 1,000 memories. "I was on my way somewhere else," he said, "but God stopped me here." The church, which had held its breath for what felt like forever, finally exhaled. People began to move, some toward the girl with blankets and extra food, others just sitting in their pews, wiping tears and wondering what kind of world they lived in, where a child had to beg for bread inside a house of worship, and it took a boxer to remind them of grace. Pacquiao stood slowly, his joints stiff, and offered his hand to the girl. She took it without hesitation. As he lifted her to her feet, something passed between them, not just gratitude or charity, but recognition. He saw himself in her. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense, literally. He had once sat in a church just like this, stomach gnawing at his ribs, waiting for someone to see him. And now, decades later, he had become the man who answered that need. He walked with her down the aisle of the church, his hand resting gently on her back. The crowd parted. Some reached out to touch him, but most simply watched in silence. It was no longer about fame or photos. It was about something much older than that, older than religion even. It was about hunger, not just for food, but for dignity, for kindness, for the miracle of being noticed. Outside, the rain had turned to mist. The church doors stood open, and the light filtering through them looked different now, warmer, like it carried a promise. Pacquiao paused at the threshold. He looked down at the girl and then back at the church behind him. "She's with me now," he said quietly, not as a declaration, as a vow. And without waiting for permission, without looking back again, he stepped out into the rain. The girl followed, still holding his hand. And inside the church, for the first time that morning, someone began to sing again. Not a hymn from a book, but a soft, trembling voice, raw with emotion, rising from a pew in the back. Others joined in, unsure of the words but sure of the moment. It was not liturgy. It was not tradition. It was mercy. And it sounded like hope. They walked together under the soft drizzle. No umbrella, no entourage, just a man and a girl with bare feet slapping gently against the wet pavement. The air smelled of rain-soaked concrete and distant car exhaust, but for a few rare moments, it all felt clean. Pacquiao didn't speak much as they moved through the narrow side streets, past stalls being covered hastily with tarps, past vendors packing up mangoes and fish, past old men watching from under plastic awnings who whispered and nudged each other as they recognized him. He offered a simple nod to each one but didn't break stride. The girl walked beside him, her shoulders hunched, not out of fear, but uncertainty. Every few steps she would glance up at him, as if to make sure he was still real, still there, still hers for another second. He never let go of her hand. When they reached the edge of a quiet road overlooking the estuary, he stopped beneath the shelter of a rusted metal awning. Across the water, the skyline of Manila shimmered in the silver morning light, grey buildings against greyer clouds, with a few patches of pale sun peeking through like broken promises. Pacquiao crouched beside her again, this time at her level, his knees creaking slightly. The rain had matted her hair to her scalp, and she shivered, not from the cold, but from something deeper. He took off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was far too large, of course, it swallowed her. but she held it close like it was the first thing in weeks that had weight, warmth, and purpose. He asked her name. She hesitated, then spoke, slowly. Adama. Her voice cracked halfway through like the word hadn't been used in a long time. He repeated it softly like a prayer. Adama. It rolled off his tongue like he was familiar with pain that hides behind short names. He asked no questions after that, not where she came from, not how she'd gotten there. Some things, he understood, didn't need to be spoken, in the curve of her spine, in the scars that dotted her knees, in the way she flinched when someone laughed too loud nearby. She had lived too much. For someone so small, her silence was dense with survival. But others did ask. The moment went viral before the hour was out. Videos of Pacquiao feeding her in the church flooded social media. People captioned it with awe, reverence, even confusion. Pacquiao breaks down in church. A miracle in Manila. The puncher becomes the prophet. News stations began replaying the clip before noon. Commentators speculated who the girl was, how he'd known her, what would happen next. But the man himself remained quiet. No press release, no tweet, no headline from him. What he did instead was take her to a small shelter run by women he'd known since his earliest days as a boxer. Women who used to bring him rice and tinapa when he was nothing but a scrawny street kid who shadowboxed between bus stops. They opened the gates for him without hesitation. They took one look at Adama and knew, not just what she'd suffered, but what needed to come next. They cleaned her wounds, washed her hair, gave her warm food that didn't come from a stranger's hand. They found her a small bed with a sheet that smelled like detergent, not sweat. One of the women, a retired nurse named Mercy, found an old box of clothes in the back room and pulled out a blue cotton dress that was faded but whole. When they put it on her, Adama stood in front of the mirror for a long time, just staring at her reflection. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. That night, Pacquiao sat with her on the steps of the shelter. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet soil and mango trees. Crickets chirped in the dark and street dogs barked in the distance. Adama held a small notebook someone had given her and a crayon, purple. It was the only one in the box that wasn't broken. She began to draw. Her hands were clumsy at first, but steady. She drew a figure, short hair, a plate in one hand, a girl beside him, a church behind them. Above, a simple sun with long, radiating lines. She worked in silence, focused. When she finished, she held the notebook up to him. "That's you," she said. He smiled and touched his chest, half laughing. "I'm taller in real life," he said. She looked at him, completely serious. "No, you're bigger in here," she said, pointing to the figure's heart. He looked away. He wasn't good at hiding when something hit him. For a moment, his eyes filled again, but he blinked it back. "I was like you once," he said after a while. "I lived on the street. I begged. I prayed for scraps. Some nights I thought the sky had forgotten I was alive." Adama didn't respond, but she shifted closer. "My mother used to tell me God sees even the smallest sparrow," he continued, "but I didn't believe it. Not until someone gave me food one day without asking who I was. No questions, just rice and fish and a smile. That was enough." He turned to her then. "You're not invisible, Adama." She didn't speak, but she nodded slowly, as if the words were heavy, but welcome. Over the next few weeks, her story unfolded in quiet chapters. They found a distant relative of hers, an aunt who had once lived in Nigeria but had moved to Cebu 5 years earlier. She cried when she saw Adama on television, reached out. Papers were filed, meetings arranged. Pacquiao paid for the medical tests, the transportation, the school registration. But it was never about the money. It was about making sure she had a name again, a birthday, a toothbrush, a desk at school with her own notebooks, a world where someone would notice if she didn't come home. The day she left for Cebu, she hugged him without speaking, just wrapped her arms around his waist and held on. He hugged her back, kissed the top of her head. He didn't give her advice, just a single promise. "You will never be alone again." She nodded, got in the van, waved from the window. The last image most people saw of her was from a short clip taken by one of the shelter workers. Adama seated at a desk, a fresh uniform still a bit too big on her, a name tag pinned to her chest. She was drawing again. This time, a schoolhouse, flowers in front, a girl standing in the doorway, arms outstretched. In the corner of the paper, she'd written her own name for the first time. And under it, in crooked, childlike letters, "Thank you for seeing me." That night, in an interview he hadn't planned on giving, Pacquiao was asked why he did what he did, why he stopped, why he cried, why he carried a plate into a church full of strangers. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Because that's what I would want someone to do if it was my daughter." He looked directly into the camera, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. "And because I remember what it's like to pray and hear nothing." He stood. The interviewer tried to ask another question, but he was already gone. Back into the Manila dusk, back to being the man who would rather feed one child than impress a million. Because some miracles do not arrive on clouds of glory. They come on foot, wearing old shoes, holding a plate, and sometimes they cry too.